In the spring of 1940, France stood still beneath clear skies, its cities alive with conversation, cafes bustling, and newspapers offering quiet confidence. To many, the horrors of the First World War seemed like a distant nightmare that would never return. France had fortified its borders, planned every scenario, and built what was considered an unbreakable line of defense. Yet within weeks, that sense of security would collapse under the weight of a new kind of war, faster, deadlier, and unlike anything Europe had seen before. After World War I, France had poured its hopes and resources into the Maginot Line, a massive, fortified wall stretching along its border with Germany. It was a marvel of engineering: deep concrete bunkers, heavy artillery, tunnels connecting garrisons, and underground rail systems. Politicians and generals alike saw it as a guarantee of safety. But they had made one critical mistake. The Maginot Line didn't cover the entire border. To the north, the border with Belgium remained exposed, and the Ardennes Forest was left lightly defended. French planners had dismissed the thick, hilly woods as impassable for tanks, believing no serious army would try to move an invasion force through it. They were wrong. On the other side of the border, Adolf Hitler had a different vision. Germany's defeat in the Great War had not been forgotten, and the Nazi regime had rebuilt its military with ruthless focus. By 1940, the German Wehrmacht was more mobile, better coordinated, and more aggressive than anything Europe had faced. It no longer fought wars of attrition, it fought wars of speed. The German strategy was Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, a tactic based on shock, rapid movement, and coordination between air and ground forces. It was not about slowly grinding the enemy down, it was about smashing through before they had time to respond. On May 10, 1940, Hitler gave the order. German forces launched a sweeping invasion across Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. It looked, at first, like a replay of the First World War. As expected, the French and British armies rushed north to meet the invasion in Belgium. But it was a trap. The real strike was already in motion. Silent columns of German tanks and motorized infantry were moving through the Ardennes. In just a matter of days, German panzer divisions broke through the French lines along the river Meuse. The so-called impassable Ardennes had become a highway. The breakthrough was faster than anyone expected. French commanders, still preparing for a long, grinding battle in Belgium, were caught off guard. Reports of German tanks deep behind the front lines were initially dismissed as panic or confusion. But it was all too real. The German armored spearhead didn't stop. It raced west, toward the English Channel, aiming to trap the entire British Expeditionary Force and a large portion of the French army. Paris received the news in fragments. Within military headquarters, orders were delayed, plans scrambled, and tempers frayed. The German advance was not only rapid, it was devastatingly precise. The Allied armies were being sliced in two, their rear exposed, their communications shattered. Civilians across northern France began to flee. The highways became rivers of people, families in cars, carts, bicycles, anything that could move, desperately trying to escape the approaching terror. Bombs fell on towns from German aircraft, and the fear spread faster than the fire. The roads were clogged, supplies ran short, and the mood turned from confusion to despair. There was no organized evacuation. There was only chaos. By late May, nearly 400,000 British and French troops had been pushed into a pocket around the coastal town of Dunkirk. They were surrounded, cut off from reinforcements, and running out of options. What followed next would become one of the most remarkable episodes in military history. Over the course of 9 tense days, a hastily assembled fleet of warships, ferries, fishing boats, and even civilian yachts crossed the English Channel to rescue the trapped soldiers. Operation Dynamo, as it was called, managed to evacuate more than 330,000 men. It was a narrow escape, but for France, the damage had already been done. The core of its army had been defeated or pushed aside. The remaining forces were scattered, demoralized, and under relentless attack. German troops continued their march through France, facing little organized resistance. Town after town surrendered. The French army, confused and leaderless, could not regroup. On June 14, German forces entered Paris. There was no battle. The city had been declared open, and the French government had already fled south to Bordeaux. A city that had once stood defiant in the First World War now watched in silence as Nazi flags were hoisted over its buildings. Less than 2 weeks later, France officially surrendered. On June 25, 1940, the armistice was signed not in a government office or a battlefield tent, but inside a railway carriage in Compiègne, the very same spot where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler, who had obsessed over that humiliation for years, watched as history was reversed. The world looked on in disbelief. One of the most powerful nations in Europe had fallen in just 6 weeks. It was not simply a defeat, it was a collapse. France had not been conquered through superior numbers, but through superior strategy, mobility, and shock. Its faith in old tactics, in concrete walls, and in political assumptions had failed. The war was far from over, but for France, the first act had ended in disaster. The lightning unleashed. The invasion was not a march. It was a storm. It didn't announce itself with slow build-up or warning shots. It came with roaring engines, thundering skies, and a speed that stunned the world. Germany didn't fight like anyone expected. While the French army waited for trench lines and static warfare, the Germans sent tanks racing like arrows through the countryside, supported by screaming dive bombers and relentless motorized infantry. What they unleashed in May 1940 was not war as France remembered it. It was Blitzkrieg lightning war, and it was already working. The initial thrust through Belgium had worked exactly as intended. France and Britain had taken the bait. Their strongest armies moved north, into Belgium, to stop what looked like a replay of the First World War. They believed this was the main front. It wasn't. Germany's real power was pouring through the Ardennes, where no one thought tanks could go. And not just a few tanks, entire panzer divisions, led by generals like Heinz Guderian, were moving faster than maps could track. Towns fell before the local commanders even realized they were under attack. Resistance was rare, confused, and quickly crushed. The French army, slow to communicate and rigid in its chain of command, had no time to respond. Orders were delayed. Units were stranded. Some divisions, expecting to face a German assault head-on, suddenly found enemy tanks roaring past their flanks. Rear lines crumbled before the front lines even saw action. Supply chains collapsed, communication wires were cut, and soldiers were overrun before they fired a shot. The Germans weren't just faster, they were smarter. They bypassed strong points and encircled them. They avoided long battles. Every move was designed to trap and isolate, to surround and suffocate. One of the most devastating breakthroughs came at Sedan. The German army crossed the Meuse River with terrifying ease. French defenses, outdated and thin, couldn't hold. Within 48 hours, the Germans had carved a deep wedge into France's interior. Behind them, columns of refugees flooded the roads, clogging every possible route south. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, bombed the highways, bridges, and villages. Civilians ran with what little they could carry. Women, children, the elderly all swept into the same wave of panic. The skies were never silent. The thunder of aircraft overhead became a permanent sound. Within days, the German advance reached the English Channel. It was faster than even Hitler had expected. In a single stroke, they had trapped the British Expeditionary Force and a huge section of the French army in the north. The Allied forces were now backed up against the sea. The trap had closed. At Dunkirk, nearly 400,000 troops were encircled. The beaches were wide, flat, and vulnerable. German bombers strafed the sand. There was no port large enough for ships to dock. It should have been a massacre. But something extraordinary happened. In Britain, civilian vessels, fishing boats, tugboats, even pleasure yachts answered the call. Alongside the Royal Navy, they crossed the channel under constant fire and began pulling soldiers from the beaches. It was slow, dangerous, and chaotic. But it worked. Over 9 days, more than 330,000 soldiers were evacuated. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a total loss either. Britain had survived. France, however, was left bleeding. With the north collapsing, the French government panicked. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud struggled to hold his ministers together. Some demanded a counter-offensive. Others whispered of surrender. There was no consensus. The cabinet fought over maps while the Germans took cities. Paris braced for battle, but no battle came. On June 14, German troops entered the capital without resistance. The French army had already withdrawn. The city, once filled with life and pride, now stood eerily quiet as Nazi banners hung from balconies and soldiers marched past the Eiffel Tower. The sound of German boots on Parisian streets marked not just a military defeat, but a psychological one. France, the Great Republic, the Empire, the victor of 1918, was broken. Still, some resistance flickered. A few generals tried to organize defenses in the south. A new line along the Loire River was proposed. But morale was gone. Divisions had melted. Entire units had surrendered without firing a shot. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, striking at will. Every plan was already outdated by the time it reached the field. The government, now relocated to Bordeaux, could barely keep track of its own armies. Then came the final blow. On June 17, Marshal Philippe Pétain, a hero of World War I, addressed the nation. In a radio broadcast, his voice heavy and resigned, he announced that France would seek an armistice. The words felt surreal. A generation that had survived the trenches, that had rebuilt from the ruins of 1914 to 1918, was now being told it was over. That France, so proud of its culture, its history, its military strength, had lost not in a year, not in months but in 6 short, violent weeks. On June 22, the terms of surrender were signed. Hitler chose the location deliberately, a railway carriage in Compiègne, the very same spot where Germany had signed its humiliation in 1918. This time, it was France's turn. Hitler stood silently as the terms were read. For him, it was symbolic revenge. For France, it was the end of a republic. The country was split. The Germans occupied the north and west, including Paris. The rest, under the so-called Vichy government, remained officially neutral but effectively under Nazi control. It was a nation divided, humiliated, and occupied. French citizens woke up the next day not under their own flag, but under swastikas. The speed of the fall stunned the world. No one had expected France to collapse so completely, so quickly. Allied nations were shaken. Enemies were emboldened. It wasn't just the loss of territory, it was the loss of belief. France had not just lost a war. It had lost its place. What made the defeat so devastating was not just the strength of the enemy, but the failures of leadership, the outdated strategies, and the deep political divisions that had left the country paralyzed in a moment that demanded unity. Blitzkrieg hadn't just broken the army, it had broken the system. As German tanks rolled south and French flags were lowered, one thing became clear: the world that had existed before May 1940 was gone. In its place stood a new, darker chapter in European history. Trapped at the edge of the world. The sea was cold and grey, the skies filled with smoke, and the beaches of Dunkirk were packed with men waiting for a miracle. Soldiers stood in lines stretching miles along the sand, exhausted, filthy, and silent. Behind them, the German army closed in. In front of them, the open sea offered the only hope. There were no speeches, no music, no banners. Just the sound of waves, distant gunfire, and the low hum of engines across the water. What was happening at Dunkirk was not a planned operation. It was a desperate escape. When German tanks reached the Channel coast in late May 1940, they had achieved something that even they had barely believed possible. In less than 3 weeks, they had outflanked the main Allied forces and pushed them into a shrinking pocket along the northern French coast. Hundreds of thousands of British and French troops were surrounded. They had nowhere to go. The ports were bombed, rail lines were cut, roads were jammed with refugees. The Germans had total control of the sky. It should have been the final blow. But then, something changed. Hitler hesitated. For reasons still debated by historians: caution, overconfidence, or fear of muddy terrain slowing the tanks, he ordered the advance to pause for a few critical days. That pause gave the British time to do something no one expected: attempt a mass evacuation across the English Channel. The plan was called Operation Dynamo. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't even fully organized. But it was fast. Royal Navy destroyers were dispatched immediately, but there weren't enough to carry all the men waiting on the beaches. So, a call went out to fishermen, merchants, ferry operators, even private citizens, anyone with a seaworthy vessel. And the people responded. Hundreds of small boats set sail from England, across dangerous waters, into a war zone. On the beaches, the scene was chaos and order at once. Troops lined up in shallow water, knee-deep, hoping for a chance to board something, anything that could float. Aircraft screamed overhead, dropping bombs that sent sand and bodies flying. The Luftwaffe hunted the ships like wolves. Destroyers burned. Boats capsized. But they kept coming. Day after day, the boats returned, lifting men from the jaws of disaster. Over 9 days, more than 330,000 soldiers were evacuated. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't defeat either. For Britain, it was survival. For France, it was something else, the moment it realized it was being left behind. The French soldiers who remained fought bravely, holding the line to buy time for the evacuation. Many of them died on the beaches, covering the withdrawal. Others were captured. Entire French divisions, cut off from command and supplies, surrendered en masse. By early June, the last British troops had left Dunkirk. The French were on their own. In Paris, the reality of the defeat could no longer be ignored. The military was collapsing, town by town. The government, now based in Bordeaux, was in crisis. Prime Minister Paul Reynaud begged Britain and the United States for help. but Britain was in no position to send reinforcements, and America was still neutral. Every day, the news grew darker. German forces continued to advance, seemingly unstoppable. The army had lost its will. The country had lost its direction. Inside the French cabinet, arguments turned bitter. Some ministers still believed in resistance. Others had already accepted defeat. Reynaud wanted to continue the fight, perhaps from French colonies in North Africa. But he was losing support. The war had revealed the fractures beneath the Republic: political infighting, outdated military thinking, and a lack of coordination that had paralyzed decision-making when it mattered most. Then, a familiar face stepped forward. Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, the symbol of France's endurance in the Great War, took the microphone on June 17. In a solemn, tired voice, he told the French people he would seek an armistice. He said it was to spare them further suffering, to prevent more bloodshed, to protect what remained. But in truth, it marked the end of resistance. France was about to surrender. The decision sent shockwaves through the army, through the streets, through every corner of a nation still reeling. Soldiers cried, civilians wept, and many felt something break inside. Pride, perhaps. Or the belief that France could never fall. Now it had. As the formal armistice was arranged, German troops entered Paris without resistance. The City of Light, once the center of culture and revolution, now stood silent under Nazi banners. No shots were fired. The government had fled. The people had no orders. They watched the occupiers march through their streets with a numbness that came not from surprise, but from exhaustion. On June 22, France signed the terms of its surrender. The location was chosen with cold calculation, the same railway carriage in Compiègne where Germany had been forced to sign its surrender in 1918. Hitler stood watching, his face expressionless, as the French delegation signed the document. Then he walked out, leaving them alone in silence. The terms were harsh. France was divided into two zones. The north and west were occupied by German forces, including Paris. The south would remain nominally independent, under the so-called Vichy government, led by Pétain. But in reality, it was a puppet regime, operating under the shadow of German control. The fall of France was complete. What had begun as a confident stand behind the Maginot Line had ended in division, occupation, and shame. A great power had collapsed not just under enemy fire, but under its own weight of bad decisions, outdated ideas, and a leadership that couldn't agree even in the face of disaster. The world took note. The United States watched in disbelief. Britain braced for invasion, knowing it now stood alone. Germany had proven its strength, not just with weapons, but with speed, ruthlessness, and a new kind of war that no one had been ready for. But even as France lay defeated, something stirred beneath the surface. Not everyone accepted the armistice. Not everyone believed the fight was over. In exile, in hiding, in occupied towns and colonies abroad, voices would soon rise, quiet at first, then louder. France had fallen, but it had not disappeared. A new struggle was beginning, one not on open battlefields, but in the shadows. The storm had passed, but the war was far from over.